Grüezi and welcome to Classical Cake, the podcast where we discuss topics relating to Viennese classical music while enjoying one of Vienna's delicious cakes. I'm your host, Daniel Adam Maltz. Today's musicians use a common language to read and interpret music from all musical eras. But do we lose something with this general approach? Just as spoken language evolves over time, so does the way composers communicate their intentions. Do we as musicians really know how to interpret the language of classical era composers such as Mozart and Beethoven? Today, we will discuss this topic with Malcolm Bilson, a pioneer in the historically informed performance movement. Bilson is one of the most respected leaders in this field, and is the Frederick J. Whiten Professor of Music Emeritus at Cornell University. He's released numerous videos including Knowing the Score Volume 2, Performing the Score, and most recently, Taste. We're at the Piano Technicians Guild convention in Tucson, Arizona, far away from the cafe houses of Vienna. So our cake today will be a local specialty, tres leches cake. This tasty dessert is made by poking holes in a very light sponge cake, then soaking it in 3 different types of milk: evaporated milk, sweetened condensed milk, and whole milk. It is then topped with sweetened whipped cream. This cake sounds like a dream for a dairy lover like me. Let's dig in. I hope you like sugar.
I like sugar.
There's a lot of it in there.
But this is terrific.
Your videos show that historically informed performance provides opportunities to rediscover a musical language and to make interpretations and performances more interesting for both the audience and the performer. At the start of Knowing the Score, you discussed the word interpreter. Why is understanding the nuance of the word interpreter important for our approach in performing music?
Well, you see, interpreter, how should I say this? I don't speak Turkish, so I need an interpreter. So the interpreter has to do 2 things. One is he has to understand what's being said, and the second thing is he has to render this as best he can. Those are 2 different things, and it seems to me it's the same thing is true with music. Now, the difficulty that somebody like me has, when you watch a film that was made in 1960, and it's about the 20s, the music that they play will probably be not exactly like what it was in the 20s, you see. And we think that it should be like it was in the 20s, and it shouldn't be sort of souped up to sound more contemporary in 1960. So basically my problem when I go and give a master class, I'm almost never telling anybody what to do. I'm always telling them what to read. In other words, if we take, for instance, Mozart writes 2 things in his scores. One of them is the notes. These are these little round guys that are either in a space or on a line. And if you know what they are, then this is considered reading music. But Mozart writes something else, and that is he writes what we call articulation slurs, half moon, crescents over notes, dots over notes, accents over notes, piano, forte. And all of these things tell us the meaning of the music. And I simply believe that if you change these, as most modern players do, into this sort of long, my friend Robert Levin calls it maple syrup over everything, that you're losing the drama. And that's not really Mozart's music. It's as simple as that.
Yeah. Well, you opened my eyes to a completely different and freeing way of interpreting music. And so for the next few questions, I want to highlight some of the concepts that I think will be most interesting to those interpreting music of the classical era. The first concept is note lengths. For example, how long do we hold down a quarter note, or an 8th note, or a 16th note?
Yes, there's an old joke. The pianist Harold Bauer was a very famous English pianist about 100 years ago. A woman came to him and she said, I'm thinking of a note. And Harold Bauer said, a quarter note? He said, no, shorter than that. And he said, an 8th note? No, shorter than that. A 16th note? Yes, a 16th note, play me one. Now, of course, you cannot play 1/16th note because it's only how long it takes to get to the next one that has any sense. But basically, I think what is very shocking and difficult for a lot of young players is that the whole idea that you play everything legato is something that really happens in the early 19th century. And the idea is that notes that are not marked in any way, especially with one of these what we call slurs, with these crescent-shaped curved things, and so that any note that is not marked that way is not to be held full length. And that's shocking enough in itself, but the greater problem is, well, how long should it be? And the answer is, and they talk about this in the 18th century, it really is not so complicated. They talk about heavy music and light music. And the lighter the music, the shorter the notes. So, pum 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 is obviously light. If it's not connected but heavy, ta ta ti ta ti, it's not just that it's slower, but that the proportion of the time that it takes is greater. And this is how we understand, how should I put it simply, this is how we understand a comedy from a tragedy, basically. You know?
Yeah. So you've already talked about slurs a little bit, and you say in your videos that slurs means more than just simply play legato. So what else should we be reading from slurs?
Well, it's hard. I mean, the listeners have to understand what a slur is. A slur is a crescent-shaped sign above a certain number of notes. If it's over 2 notes, then we understand what they called it. It is a sigh. That's what they called it. Tia, 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 tia. The first note is stressed, the second note is less stressed, and is always short. And now, it's a little more complicated than that, but not a lot more complicated. It's a little more complicated than that by the simple fact that music also goes up and down. So ti-da, ti-da, ti-da is not the same as ti-da, ti-da, ti-da. And of course, there's also, is this piano, is this forte, but the idea that you ever play anything simply smoothly without any inflection, which many people do, if you accept the idea that they all talk about, that music is like speech, then there are no languages. Well, everybody, whenever I say this, everybody's laughing. But listen to the Metropolitan Opera on Saturday sometime. You'll hear singers who sing every note the same loudness. And that's with words, Not every singer, by the way. But a lot of them do that.
Mm-hmm. So one thing you say over and over is never, ever to play evenly.
Right.
Now, this is radically different to what most musicians are taught, so please explain this.
Well, that's what I was just talking about. If music is like speech, then you cannot play anything like this.
Sure.
It's very interesting that when you started having robots answering your calls, they all sounded like that.
Yeah.
The number is 4532. And little by little, they realized that this does not sound like a person, even though there's a person saying it. And so they had to introduce the number is 45378, whatever it is, you see. Because it's unnatural to speak without inflection.
Right.
Even if you're just giving a telephone number.
Yeah. So in the past few minutes, we've challenged many accepted modern conventions for interpreting classical music, and that's just the beginning of your teachings. In the interest of time, I want to discuss just one more concept, and that is tempo rubato.
Okay, rubato has 2 meanings. One is a later 19th century meaning, which means that you speed up and slow down. But the 17th and 18th and early 19th century meaning of tempo rubato was quite different. It means that the accompaniment stays steady while the right hand or the violin or the flute or the voice or whatever it is floats freely above it. Mozart talks about it. Chopin insisted on it. He insisted on the students practicing first the left hand by itself and then only bring in the melody later, and to try to do this. It's very hard. Mm-hmm. It's very, very hard to do. It takes a lot of training. And if you want to hear how it's done really superbly, then you go to recordings of people like Frank Sinatra and Ella Fitzgerald who did this spectacularly, you know. There's a recording of Louis Armstrong playing Summertime on his trumpet with an orchestra in the background. He's never near them anywhere, and it just sends you right to heaven.
Wow.
Yeah.
You mentioned the difficulty of this technique. So how can a pianist go about cultivating this tempo rubato?
Well, it's all a question of taste, you see. Now, I think that you have to have taste for anything, but basically, if you start, anybody starts and says, look, here's this score, it looks like all these rhythms, you know, are very steady, but I know that it's not, because I do not talk this way. So what could it be? And then you start experimenting. And of course there are rules, and these rules, which are talked about by Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach and Leopold Mozart, but Chopin wanted to write a book to which he never got around to, but it's absolutely clear that it's the same rules, because the rules in a sense don't really change. You know, high notes are more important than low notes, and long notes more than short notes, and all these things. And so you start to experiment, and you have to have good taste. Yeah. Now I'm thinking of one pianist in particular who has given many lectures on this subject about, you know, playing tempo rubato and the hands not together and arpeggiating chords and all these wonderful things. And he does all those things, and in my opinion it's very tasteless, because I just don't think he has good taste. This is a hard thing to talk about, taste. And in this video, I talk about it. I try to talk about it in very specific ways. What got me started on that is that Haydn says to Leopold Mozart, Wolfgang's father, "Your son is the greatest composer known to me because he has, number one, taste, and number two, a profound knowledge of composition." And it's true. Taste is first. Taste is first in everything. Yeah. You know. It's what makes a great painter greater than an inferior painter, you know, it's the taste that is developed in the eye. But at some point, you've got to experiment as a painter or as a musician, and then you have to decide what to keep and what to throw away. Sure. It's not easy.
Sure.
Well, that's an interesting, the idea of, you know, with painters, because we were at a museum in San Diego last week, yeah. And there are, like in one room, there were two paintings that immediately struck both of us. And of course, they were from the great masters. Yeah. And we were talking about why did these two affect us? Why did these two capture our eyes? And it is,
of course,
the taste, yeah.
It's sort of
it's more than taste, it's insight and stuff like that.
Yeah, of course, but still, there's just that something special.
It's true.
Yeah. I would just ask one more question about this tempo rubato. You mentioned that this type of rubato playing is what was in practice for the 17th, 18th, or beginning of the 18th century. Does this mean to say that the other type of rubato, we'll call it the romantic rubato, where it's mostly just stretching, and it's both hands stretching together, is that to say that didn't exist in classical music?
Of course it existed. When you tell a story, you want to just take a little bit more time with this part, and then you rush over that part because it's not so important. Sure. It's a perfectly natural thing to do.
Well, this concept...
But you've got to make sure that you take time over the important parts and not the unimportant part. That's the tricky part.
That's the taste.
That's the taste.
You know, and is that something you said about how music from the 18th century to early 19th century sort of went a shift from a more speech-like manner to a more singing-like manner in the later
something like that. That's right. You know, I try not to. I mean, it sounds like Mozart doesn't know how to sing.
Of course not, yeah.
You see.
Yeah.
But it is true that you see, Mozart's music is operatic. And that's speaking and singing together.
You emphasize that the soul of the composition is in the notes and markings from the composer. A great example you give is the opening octave leap in Beethoven's Opus 111. You maintain that how one plays it makes all the difference in the world.
Look, I don't know about soul and things, but composers do write for instruments, including the voice. I mean, a tenor like Pavarotti gets a lot of money to sing that one octave above middle C. If I play it on the piano, it's not worth anything. You know? Because when a violin goes up in the high registers, or when a bass goes down into the low registers, I mean, this is all part of music, you know. And it's very much has to do with what the instruments are.
Sure.
So actually a better example than Opus 111 is the Hammerklavier Sonata, which begins with this tremendous leap in the left hand, and there's a very, very good orchestration of that by Felix Weingartner. But the timpani plays a low B flat, and the orchestra comes in, and the whole excitement of this leap is lost. Mm-hmm. But what could he do? He couldn't do anything else.
In today's world, where competitions are king, the concept of going against modern performance practice seems like the opposite of what one might want to do to win. How does a competition entrant reconcile your teachings against the modern international standard?
I'll tell you. First of all, when you have a competition, there are two groups of people who may do well or may do poorly. One of them is the group of people who are playing, and the other is the people who are listening. And if the people who are listening are which very, very often you have, are somehow, how should I put it, less educated than the people who are playing, they probably won't advance them. I have encouraged people to go into competitions not giving a hoot about whether they win or not. You know, for one thing, going into competitions, people love competitions, and the big competitions get big audiences. Years ago, I was in Australia, and there was the big Sydney competition going on. And there was a favorite of the audience named Roger Wright. I don't know what happened to him, an American who was eliminated at the second round. And people were angry and said, no, he's our favorite. And they said to Roger Wright, well, you know, how do you feel about this? He says, I feel wonderful. I came to this wonderful country, played in this beautiful opera house, and met all these wonderful people. I'm very happy. And what happened is, at the end of the competition, the ABC, Australian Broadcasting Company, put out one CD of the winners and another CD of Roger Wright, who did just fine. So I say, if you want to go into a competition, excuse my language, screw the judges, just play what you think is convincing. And if you're really good, you'll convince the best judges, and there you are.
Yeah. So in addition to watching your videos, where can the audience go to learn more about classical era performance practice?
I think I would recommend Sandra Rosenblum's book, which is now 30 or 40 years old, but which is still very good. Performance Practices in Classic Piano Music. It's been translated to several languages, I believe. And she did all her homework. If you want to know what anybody says about the length of a quarter note, she'll tell you that Carl Philipp Emanuel Bach says this on page that, and Turk says this on page that, and it's all there. It's a great source for just finding the original things and making up your own mind.
Yeah, good. For anyone looking to improve their interpretation of music, I highly recommend Bilson's videos. You can view them at malcolmbilson.com and on YouTube. If you haven't already, please subscribe to Classical Cake. Visit classicalcake.com for more episodes and exclusive content relating to Viennese classical music and culture. Bilson, thank you for enjoying this Classical Cake with me today.
Delicious.
And thanks to you listeners for tuning in. I'm Daniel Adam Maltz. See you in Vienna. Auf Wiederschauen.